But why don't we get into, so I have a bunch of slides here with just different examples and some stories to tell to pull out some lessons.
Perfect.
Great.
Let's do it.
People who are watching may have seen this photo before. It's a pretty iconic photo. This is a lunch counter sit-in, Jackson, Mississippi, 1963, Woolworths. And the reason why I picked it first is it's a great example of a primary concept that I operate on, which we call action logic. So this was a moment when the campaign was to integrate lunch counters as part of a larger movement for racial justice and civil rights. And so the tactic was, this is traditional civil disobedience, where you're breaking the law that is, the law itself is the injustice. So the law says black people and white people can't sit together at a lunch counter. You break that law and out of principle. And the image here is black students and white students sitting in, and then this angry mob of people who would now, be the IDW crowd, throwing like.
No, the ID to be fair, and I hate the phrase "to be fair," but the IDW crowd would be like, we have to consider the consequences of not pouring milkshakes on these people.
Right?
Look, I'm an integrationist.
Yeah,
we need to consider the long-term
It would be
consequences.
to defend a few people in that picture who were doxxed by.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that would
exactly.
be it. Yes, it would be to find the narrow, irrelevant side point to have a moral panic about. Yes, exactly. Yes.
And so, all these angry white people are throwing food on them, and the reason that it has what we call action logic is you can look at this image and you immediately know what they want, you know who they are, you know who's against them, and you know why.
Right.
And it doesn't require any words. They're not holding protest signs. The image speaks for itself. It's logical. The act that they're doing itself tells the story, because even though direct action is fundamentally about material power and leveraging pressure, it also is fundamentally narrative-based. It's fundamentally about how do you tell a story of a pathway to liberation. And action, not every action needs to have high action logic, but when you're like blockading a highway, you need to do a lot more work to explain to people what you're doing, unless you're protesting the existence of that highway or something like that.
Right.
And so that's the first principle, action logic. So if you want to go to the next slide, this is an example of an action that I coordinated that had high action logic, which was, this was 10 years ago, 2009. So direct action can be incredibly material. It can also be about building a symbolic flashpoint, which was the goal of this action. So at the time, in the back of this picture, I couldn't find a better picture, but I thought this one was fun. There's smokestacks, and those smokestacks are from the coal-fired power plant that powered Congress. It literally powered the congressional building. And if you were to rotate the camera angle, you'd see the congressional building directly next to the smokestacks. And so there had been a lot of agitation around trying to get this power plant switched away from coal to clean energy. And it was actually Nancy Pelosi at the time who for years had been sort of waffling in the wind about it. And
I don't know about that. Fuck that.
Basically, the Democrats kept passing resolutions to do it and then not actually implementing them. And so
Nice.
We coordinated...
Super core brand Democrat right there.
Totally. And so we shut it down. We brought a few thousand people and did an occupation. We blockaded the whole thing, nobody in or out, shut it down for a day. And so the action logic was clear. This is the coal-fired power plant that powers Congress literally and figuratively. The fossil fuel industry is powering Congress right now. And so the idea was to build a flashpoint action. This was like before Occupy Wall Street. This was before there were memes that really got underneath sort of moneyed influence. And there were a number of different campaigns going on around clean energy that were going to then leverage this message from that. And we actually, by the end of that day, Nancy Pelosi came out and announced that they were going to transition it off of coal, and then they did. And The reason why I share that is not because direct action usually has that much immediate satisfaction. And actually, it was kind of a sour satisfaction because they transitioned it to liquefied natural gas, which is fracking. So it's not actually that much better.
Yeah, they really have to make sure to be like, look, we'll do this. But at least some fucking water's getting lit on fire in Pennsylvania.
As long as we poison some people.
Yeah. It's like I heard
that was still when the Sierra Club was advocating for fracking.
I remember when the mainstream environmental groups they branded liquefied natural gas like the Obama of energy. They're like, it's not a clean transition, but it's also not fossil fuels either. Yeah. It's a totally new thing.
And this was an intervention on those politics too. We had I'll talk in a minute about the difference between your target and your audience.
Right.
But your targets who you're trying to pressure, your audience is all the people who are impacted by the action, and we were trying to impact the terrain of the environmental movement. And it was basically planting the seeds for what became the Keystone XL pipeline campaign of pushing these groups to be much more embracing of nonviolent direct action. And but the other thing I'll say about Pelosi jumping in front, a lot of times self-righteous activists get frustrated when politicians jump in front of the parade after it's organized to take credit for stuff and cry about co-optation. And co-optation is a real thing. There's things to watch out for, but it's a metric of success.
Right. And
the reason that we do nonviolent direct action tactics, if we're trying to pressure a politician, my friend Daniel Hunter talks about it like politicians are like a balloon, and they kind of waffle in the wind. And the terrain of advocacy, as opposed to direct action or lobbying, is like blowing on the balloon, trying to get it to move. What direct action? But those balloons, it's tied to a rock. It can only go so far, right? And that rock is the material interest of those politicians. It's either their constituency or their funding base. And the goal of campaigns is to move the rock. And so we're not getting concerned with lobbying a politician to take this or that stance. We're moving their constituency, so they have to take that stance if they're in power. And that's the way that, for example, Sunrise is building movements for the Green New Deal and trying to force politicians to take a stand by demonstrating public pressure. Right. That's how direct action is like moving the rock, as distinct from advocacy. So you want to go to the next one?
Yeah, let's go to the next one.
Great. Actually, yeah, before you can leave this one up, but before I get to this, I will just say something about the Keystone campaign, because those actions did not have action logic. That was, we started by doing this, what was it? We were basically, people were locking themselves to the White House gates.
Yep.
And we did
a
series of 12 days of mass, we called it civil disobedience, but it wasn't technical civil disobedience because people were getting arrested, but the law that was being broken was just like some ridiculous law about tourism, like you can't block the gates so that tourists can take photos.
Right.
If we were protesting that law...
You ever see that picture, by the way, of Pablo Escobar and his kid in front of the White House taking that photo?
No.
It's an amazing photo.
Nice.
Pretty funny. So you were interrupting.
So we would have interrupted
potentially Pablo Escobar taking a picture with his kid in front of the White House, so you could stop economic development.
Right.
See, I could be on Fox.
That's the reason we did it.
I could be on
Fox.
Fox.
That's the reason we did it.
Maybe they wanted to experience America, but because you hate freedom so much, Pablo Escobar and his kid can't have a family moment, and he's an entrepreneur. All
wow.
Right, I'll stop being stupid. Go ahead.
Wow, you'd be so good at that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the point
so
is
in a way, you were in front of the White House. It wasn't really politics. You were just saying we want to eat organic smoothies. In a certain sense.
Smoothies. In a certain sense.
In a certain sense.
In a certain sense.
All right.
So we had to just work a lot harder to make our message clear.
Right.
So we had to have really clear signs and messaging. We had to have our spokespersons on lock. We had to, and in that case, the arrests, they were basically just bait to get media attention in a way. Mm-hmm. And there's a double-edged sword to that. Like in a lot of conditions, like in most freedom struggles, getting captured is seen as a bad thing.
Yeah, right. It's not highly emphasized.
Yeah.
Right.
But sometimes you can provoke arrests in order to control the media narrative, if that's part of your strategy. And sometimes campaigns get a little bit too distracted by the media stuff and away, like towards spectacle and away from the material. But if you're doing it with intention, that is how what started as a flashpoint action at the White House became a multi-year-long campaign to stop an oil pipeline that was grassroots-driven from frontline indigenous communities all over the country that were doing real material block. So instead of having kind of a fake blockade in front of the White House, it was literally blockading oil tankers so they couldn't get through, and pushing the pipeline timeline further so that the legal case had more time to run through. So these things thread together in terms of material impacts. But so to jump to the one here, since we're on the topic of narrative.
Yeah.
So this is from the WTO, Battle in Seattle, 1999. And this is the Ruckus Society dropping a banner. And in the media terrain, the reason why I wanted to include this is just to give a shout out to activists who are sick of outrage culture and just saying, we're against everything and we're against this and no.
Right.
The reason why that's ineffective is that the audience then needs to decide who you are and whether, like, if you're against it, are they with you or are they with the much more reasonable person that's seeming person that's arguing against you?
Right.
And at the time, in 1999, when the global justice movement was just getting visible in the United States, it had been going in the global South for quite some time. Most people in the country didn't know who the World Trade Organization was. And so when the Ruckus Society did this dramatic tactic of climbing a crane in front of the Seattle Space Needle.
I literally remember this as a teenager.
Me too. This was like
powerful.
Politicizing moment.
Powerful.
For me.
Yep.
And this was a collaboration with Ruckus and then Rainforest Action Network, which I also worked at for several years. And so these climbers scaled the crane, dropped the banner, and instead of instead of saying WTO with like a no sign around it or like an anti-symbol, they framed it as a clash of values, right? So democracy's going this way, the WTO's going that way. The audience can bring their pre-existing values to their assessment of what you're doing, and it tells a whole story in it.
And this was, by the way, in the context of these protests, and yes, there were some things that the media focused on. There was some, windows broken at Starbucks, which, look, I no moral claim that wasn't an effective tactic at this time, and nor was it then, in my opinion, purely because that was like the prime vehicle of distraction of issues. Thomas Friedman wrote some fucking idiotic columns about how the people protesting didn't understand how trade worked. But the big takeaway was actually, and I remember this because I was transfixed. It was the first moment, if you were a 90s kid, where you actually felt like, wait a second, there are people on the street for a different world that is built. It's, less concrete and specific, I think, than the much better, more developed socialist politics that are animating us now. But it was like, no, there has to be values about labor, about democracy, about the environment, and so on. Bill Clinton came out, and, look, it's Bill Clinton, and it wasn't honest. But he was like, they're right to be protesting. He understood viscerally precisely this message, which is that, look, if you drown out all of the bullshit and all the Friedman wonkery and all of this nonsense, people understand that this is global capitalist bureaucracy against democracy.
And that was moving the rock.
Yes.
That swayed his balloon.
Yes.
And it would have really gone a long way if 9/11 hadn't happened and dropped bombs on the rock.
Yes.
No pun intended.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
I guess the last thing I'll say about this, so this is an action just 10 people were a part of this. This required serious resources to do, of course, but they dropped this banner the day before the meetings happened, when there was going to be thousands of people protesting the meetings, interrupting them. And the newspapers on that day, this was on the front page. And so this framed everything that people were going to interpret afterwards. And so the goal of this action was to control the narrative of what was about to happen so that people could leverage smarter tactics in opposition to the Friedman narrative and stuff like that you were talking about. That's where the battle of ideas does come in.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives. with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.